First of all, I would like to introduce our two eminent speakers today. Dr. Edward Brooks is Executive Director of the Oxford Character Project. His academic research is focused on virtue ethics, leadership, and character development. He founded and directs the Oxford Leadership Initiative, which draws extensively on the arts and humanities in its approach to leadership development. And he leads a major research project funded by the John Templeton Foundation on culture, character, and leadership in business, finance, law, and technology. Beyond Oxford, Edward is a visiting lecturer in the Faculty of Education at the University of Birmingham, where he teaches on character and leadership. Katy Granville-Chapman is an Associate Fellow of the Oxford Character Project and the co-founder of Global Social Leaders. Katy is waiting to be examined for a DPhil in education at Oxford, asking how leaders could improve the flourishing of those they lead. And she is a research associate at the Oxford University Wellbeing Research Centre. She is a deputy head teacher and founder of the Wellington Leadership and Coaching Institute. Katy, with Emmy Bidston, who's also on this call, is co-author of the book Leader, Know, Love and Inspire Your People, and co-chair of the Leadership for Flourishing group, a joint initiative of the Oxford Character Project and the Human Flourishing Programme at Harvard. Today, they are going to speak on reimagining educational leadership, empowering human flourishing. Over to you, Ed and Katy.
Well, thank you, Fiona, very, very much indeed. I think I speak for Katy and myself, so it's absolutely fantastic to be with you and to be part of your esteemed series of speakers through this term and this wonderful seminar. Thank you for the very kind introduction to you, David, Luana, for the invitation to join you and for this superb research project that you developed on flourishing in education. It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to be able to work together and talk together and learn together on these really important themes. So I'm going to share my screen and try and get our presentation up. So bear with me slightly as we get that going. Now, I'm hoping that's the full screen that everyone can see. Fiona, is that looking okay to you?
No, actually, it's just doesn't have a video on, I think.
Ah, it worked a moment ago, didn't it? What's going on now? Right, let's try it again. Let's try it again now.
Just team gremlins, don't worry.
There we go. We did literally just tried it before the call. Now, is that working?
Yes, that's better. We can see it now.
You can see it now?
Yeah, that's
perfect.
Excellent. There we go. Second time lucky. Super. So as Fiona says, we're going to be talking on reimagining educational leadership, empowering flourishing, and Katy and I will alternate as we work through. So what do we want to talk about? Well, flourishing as the goal of education, as you know, has gained traction amongst educational theorists and policy makers incredibly in recent years. A question we've got is how, and an important question we think, is what leadership is needed to advance flourishing in educational communities. So joining these two themes together, flourishing is really important, what leadership is needed to advance flourishing. And our proposal is that leadership can be productively reimagined as a category, as an idea, and as a practice to empower flourishing, and that such leadership can't just be kind of reimagined as just only reimagined as a concept, but can actually further flourishing in practice. And that's what we'd love to talk about and work through in the time we have now. And so we're going to do that in 5 steps, thinking briefly about this theme of flourishing, then going into the psychology of flourishing and looking at that and talking about some of the definitions and which one to adopt, looking back then to leadership and joining flourishing and leadership together, going to a case study that Katy's done in her research on leadership in education, and then some thoughts about where we're heading next in our project, and we'd love to open up to discussion and hear your thoughts as well, and love to join others together in this research program that we'd love to develop on leadership and flourishing. So that's where we're heading over the next 40 minutes or so, and we'd love to engage in some conversation, discussion, questions, suggestions, and learn from everyone together, learn from you certainly after that. So why then focus on human flourishing? Well, it's an ancient concept, the translation of eudaimonia in the Greek, often translated as happiness, but also flourishing, and flourishing perhaps captures it more adequately. But here, Aristotle, what is the highest of all goods achievable in action, as far as its name goes, most people virtually agree, for both the many and the cultivated, call it happiness or flourishing. So flourishing is the highest of all achievable goods. It's the highest human good. What is flourishing? Aristotle says. So flourishing is the highest, most complete way of life, but there's disagreement about what that way of life is amongst philosophers. And so Aristotle, as he starts, and he's perhaps the classical philosopher known most for this idea of flourishing, and certainly the most important philosopher behind the recent recovery of this category of flourishing and its use in education and elsewhere in psychology. He works through in his Nicomachean Ethics, some of the answers that people might have. And he says, could it be pleasure? Well, no, that's not really distinctively human enough, perhaps too base. Could it be honor? Well, not really, because honor makes gives kind of too much away to others. It's too subjective and dependent on what others might think. Could it be money? Well, no, it's not money, because money is useful for something else. It's the something else that's important. And so he goes through and says, well, flourishing really must be something about what it means to be human. It's kind of actualization of humanness, the function of human life. And Aristotle famously talks about this as an activity, and an activity of the rational soul in accord with virtue, which means human excellence. So it's the kind of full actualization of human excellence, and human excellence is divided down into these virtues or excellences, which we can understand as qualities, positive qualities of character. So an ancient concept from Aristotle, and long used in education. So Aristotle thinks in this idea of flourishing that the life of study is one way, an important way that this ideal of flourishing can be lived out, and that flowed into education. And it meant that flourishing was taken up in the Middle Ages with an Aristotelian recovery in school mottos. And this was an important motto in many schools, Floreat Nostra Schola. And if you go to an Oxford college today, or look on a college website, you're pretty likely to find a newsletter or some such a program with Floreat in it somehow. I was at Oriel College for my DPhil, and Floreat was part of the college motto there. That's historic though. So here we've brought education up to the late Middle Ages, perhaps the early modern period, and there are some remnants of that left over. But there's a more recent interest, really, even in the last 30, 40 years, through an Aristotelian recovery and philosophy from the middle of the last century, which has come then into psychology and into education more recently. And this spreads across disciplines, the humanities there in philosophy, for example, Julianus, Dan Hebron, Martha Nussbaum, in psychology and positive psychology. In Seligman's turn, has flourishing at its heart. Sonia Lyubomirsky with her important work on happiness. And education, I think you've got Christian Christensen. We've got Christian Christensen joining next week, his important work on flourishing then as a category in education. So there's a new contemporary interest in philosophy and psychology, and that's really flown now into education, thinking about education as the goal. But why now? Why has this come about now? So an important moment, I think, for education to focus on flourishing in two ways, a kind of negative and a positive. A negative, perhaps, because there's a sense that flourishing could be under threat. There's great progress in lots of ways, life expectancy, health, prosperity. This is Steven Pinker's work that I guess you're familiar with. But as well, there's an incredible inequality which is being identified and observed. Mental health is challenged, and even with a kind of amazing education systems, by one metric of success, there are severe challenges in mental health for young people, and an example would be in Hong Kong, where this is a real concern. And of course, there are the pervasive uncertainties across society that we live within and mean we're connecting now, not in person in the wonderful environment of St Anthony's College, but via Zoom. And these don't just extend through COVID, but well beyond to all kinds of global uncertainties, environmental, not least. And these are those that David and Fiona have identified as underlying this concern in human flourishing and uncertainty in the midst of uncertainty as the backdrop, if you like. So there's this challenge. How do we carry on flourishing? How can we flourish now? But there's also this potential to advance flourishing in the present moment. So we're at a bit of a turning point. And if you listen to Mark Carney's Wreath lectures, he picked up importantly on this turning point just before Christmas regarding what our values are as a society, and a moment to re-inspect those, but also a moment to think about not just what our values are, but how we understand value altogether, and perhaps to turn a renegotiation from understanding value purely in market terms to more broadly human terms. There's been a renewal of education, or thoughts about a renewal of education for the 21st century, and there's some important work by the OECD in that, and Derek Bock's book, particularly Engaging Higher Education, is fantastic and talks about the kinds of education we need and the importance of flourishing in that now. And there's great work done and great advances in the development and measurement of character and flourishing too. So a real opportunity at the moment to be seized. But what definition, Katy?
Yeah, and it's really, really interesting because scholars really don't agree on which definition of flourishing we should use. And that's been pointed out in quite a lot of the literature. Butler and Kern in particular say there's no actual optimum measure of flourishing or model of flourishing, but actually different conceptualizations work in different situations. But you do need a conceptualization of well-being, and to provide a concrete domain that can actually be measured, developed and sustained is really helpful. Often what we measure is what we value. And so a lot of work is now being put into measuring flourishing and trying to come up with the best possible measure of flourishing. And again, there's still realization that it will slightly depend upon the situation. So a global measure of flourishing is likely to be different to a measure of flourishing that you'd want to use just to look at a smaller environment, say a school or a business.
So back to the classical idea of flourishing just for a moment in the philosophical realm, and Christian's coming next week, so he can explain in great detail his wonderful definition from a philosophical perspective, in the Aristotelian perspective, of what flourishing is. And it's there for you if you want to have a look at it and start to kind of get your head around the different components and subcomponents. But the basic idea that he's developing, and that's important through from Aristotle, is that human flourishing is an activity, and it's an activity of a meaningful life. Okay, so it's not just a state, it's an activity, and it's an activity that actualizes fundamental human capacities. So it's an activity in accord with the function of humanness, the function of what it means to be human, and the important capacities that go with that, and participates in these characteristic human goods, things that are valuable about human life in our rationality, in our society, not just as individuals as well, but important relational goods too.
So back to a bit of psychology, and here's one definition that's really often quoted actually in the literature, and is really interesting because it's quite similar to the philosophical definitions, but very much sitting with psychologists, and you're starting to see a massive overlap between the writings in philosophy and psychology, which I think is really, really exciting. So this one from Fredrickson and Lasada, they say living within an optimal range of human functioning, one that connotes goodness, generativity, growth and resilience. And you can see that link back to goodness and virtue, tracing it all the way back to Aristotle. We're really lucky to have been doing a little bit of work with the Human Flourishing Programme at Harvard. We also love this definition by Tyler van der Wheeler, which has informed a number of indices of flourishing, the Secure Flourishing Index and the Flourishing Index. And he says a state in which all aspects of a person's life is good. And so it's really interesting to unpick what he actually means by all aspects of a person's life is good. And his index picks up on a certain number of things, but we're not going to go into detail because, again, Tyler's actually coming to speak to you and us, which is really exciting. But instead, we're going to move on. So really interestingly, in psychology, you've got a similar kind of differentiation that you do in philosophy. Again, Aristotle actually differentiated between hedonic and eudaimonic flourishing. And so if you're talking about hedonic flourishing, you're talking about happiness, positive life effects, and life satisfaction. Whereas eudaimonic is more around the kind of positive psychological functioning or growth. But most scholars now agree that flourishing needs to be a multidimensional concept. It actually needs to include both hedonic and eudaimonic factors. So if a person's to be flourishing, they need to be doing well hedonically and eudaimonically. So in my research, I had to find a way of conceptualizing flourishing that could be easily understood by educators. It needs to be applicable to their work lives. And so it's really exciting to look at all the different definitions of flourishing and where they converge. And actually the one that seemed to be most representative of the literature, but also quite straightforward, easy to understand, very accessible. And I've been working in a school for a long time now, and I thought that this one worked particularly well for a school concept. So it's actually Stuart Al's model of psychological well-being and comprehensive inventory of thriving. It was evaluated in 5 samples of over 3,000 participants with diverse demographics, and it was found to have excellent psychometric properties, and it exhibited convergent validity with existing measures of well-being and obviously discriminants, which you'd want with ill-being. And they had reviewed 10 of the most prominent theories of flourishing, well-being and thriving. So it seemed like a really good one to be using in a school context for educators. So if you don't mind going on to the next one, the big reveal. So these are the dimensions that they include. So it's Sue, Tay and Dina. It was in 2014. And they include these 8 dimensions. So positive relationships. You find that in every single model of flourishing. Absolutely fundamental to a great human life. Subjective well-being, you can see very much a hedonic dimension of flourishing, engagement, meaning and purpose in life, mastery, accomplishment, autonomy and control, and optimism. Optimism's a bit interesting because a lot of people would actually put that into subjective well-being, but the literature on hope, which I'm starting to get into and learning a lot from Ed on actually, and really want to learn more on, is quite related to optimism as well. So interesting whether you do or don't have optimism as a separate category. But I did find this worked really well for schools. Teachers understood it, school leaders understood it, pupils we've tried it with, they understand it too. So I'd recommend this one if you're looking at research in schools for flourishing.
So coming back then to our connection between flourishing and leadership. First on leadership, where there's been, I guess, in a similar way to some of the factors underlying the some of the trends in late maternity that have brought flourishing to the fore, have also underlined some changes in the way we're exploring and understanding leadership. There's been a shift, if you like, from a kind of mechanized model of leadership, which accompanied the first industrial revolution, to a newly humanized understanding. And that's certainly there, as you can read it in the definition from Gary Hamel and Michael Zanini, their idea to move from a bureaucracy to a kind of humanocracy. And I'm not convinced of the word, but I love the idea that there's this refocusing on the human dimension. So if you like, we've gone from perhaps the start of the 20th century, the key text there, Frederick Taylor's principles of scientific management is the way leadership was thought about. And we've moved through today to people exploring, well, that's perhaps not the way in which we can work in a kind of radically complex society, which has come about through many changes. And now with the fourth industrial revolution and a digital age, there's a refocusing on the knowledge economy, on the human-centered aspect of what leadership means. So let's move from management to leadership, but from management to perhaps human-centered leadership in particular. And this is related to a kind of wider change in leadership, transition in leadership studies, from transactional to what's understood as transformational leadership. And James McGregor Burns is really one of the founders of the kind of academic field of leadership studies in the latter part of the last century. And he really he brings this concept of transforming or transformational leadership to the fore as a change from an external kind of contractual way of relating in transactional leadership to an idea of empowerment and of fulfilling and outworking, developing from values, and the values of leaders and followers both being important. So the enactment of values and leaders being about empowering and bringing those values and deeper motivations out and into practice. So this transition from this kind of old and more mechanistic idea to a human-centered and values-based one in the leadership discourse. And some other trends go with that. And these are kind of common trends described in leadership literature, from authority to partnership, commanding to more empowering, to discovery, creativity, abundance. And perhaps as you see on the right-hand side here, you can see that some of these words then are getting at perhaps more intrinsic goods. They're getting closer to the kinds of language we might think about when we're starting to talk about the human aspects of flourishing, of what it means to be human and the actualization of that. So there's this trend towards leadership rooted more deeply in intrinsic human goods and bringing those particularly to the fore, the human difference being really, really important and valuable. But, and here's a challenge, how can this new kind of leadership be conceptualized? And so some people even describe it as new leadership, human-centered leadership. There are many, many different models. But the point is that in moving from a kind of management and a mechanistic process, there's this question mark, this gap. What does leadership become? And Keith Grint, who is a prominent professor of leadership here in Oxford and then at Warwick, talks about leadership, I think quite rightly and helpfully, as more of an art or array of arts than a science in the late modern world. And this is where we'd love to bring flourishing into the picture. So this is our idea that from leadership understood in this mechanistic way, it can be understood actually in line with this new work on flourishing as being really about empowering flourishing. So we can join flourishing to leadership in a way that provides a kind of helpful way to conceptualize and to cultivate what good leadership is. So this new leadership can be, this new human-centered leadership can be focused by the theme of flourishing. And secondly, they're not just kind of helping us to reconceptualize and reimagine leadership in the abstract, but joining leadership to flourishing provides a way to move flourishing forward as well. So to move flourishing from policy to practice when it comes to helping individuals and organizations and societies, because there are leaders everywhere and many people can then help. People can lead from all kinds of places and can further flourishing of those around them if they're so oriented and equipped. School leadership, Katy.
So why school leadership for flourishing? Why is that a good thing to consider? As Ed said, leadership has got the potential to be an amazing way of moving flourishing forwards for individuals, for organisations and for society. But why school leadership in particular? So those in positions of leadership, if anyone's ever worked in a school, absolutely you will know they have the opportunity to influence the flourishing of teachers, either positively or not so positively. But the really good news, if you start to conceptualise leadership as empowering flourishing, then it's no longer confined to those informal positions. And this is particularly true in a school context. Every school leader, every teacher has the opportunity to work with literally thousands of young people every day and touch the communities beyond the school gates as well. And so anyone can impact positively the flourishing of others. So actually what we're saying is that an act of leadership is when you actually empower another person to flourish, when you improve their flourishing. Having a positive impact on the flourishing of others is definitely important in effective school leadership if you only define school leadership in instrumental terms. And there's quite good evidence, it's quite limited, but there is evidence that actually when teachers are enabled to flourish, the pupils' outcomes actually improve over a range of measures, including the kind of bottom value added and GCSE and A-level results if you're working kind of in UK money. There's limited research though on the impact of school leaders on flourishing, so it's a really exciting area to be involved in because it's got the real potential not only to have this intrinsic benefit of boosting flourishing across our societies through improving teacher flourishing, but also to improve instrumental goods as well, so improving the attainment of students too. So onto a research project, and yeah, I was very, very lucky to ask that question. So why did I choose this question? Well, as said, you've got the intrinsic value of flourishing, which no one can argue against. There's definitely the impact on learning, and there's also the impact on organisational performance. So it seemed like a really rational thing to be studying. So what's also been found, just a little bit of evidence, teacher flourishing does correlate with pupil performance, and Briner and Dewberry does a study on this, and also a colleague from the Oxford's Department of Education, who David will know really well, Pam Salmons and her team also showed that improvements in teacher wellbeing and teacher job satisfaction led to improvements in pupil attainment, and there was really clear correlation there. But really sadly, teachers are not all flourishing. So YouGov survey, it's quite a small YouGov survey, but evidence from beyond that suggests that this is probably quite an accurate picture of what's happening for teachers, particularly during COVID-19. It's slightly terrifying to think that 55% of our poor teachers might be suffering from anxiety, 44% of them, while they're desperately trying to help young people to learn on screen, are struggling themselves to concentrate, and 29% tragically responding to this survey said that they were feeling hopeless. So again, just really emphasising the importance of this particular area of research. And there's been quite a lot of research around stressful jobs, and it was found that teaching is actually probably one of the most stressful jobs in the world. So anything that we can do to enable teachers to flourish more and experience less negative stress has got to be a good thing. So if we just go on one more. Brilliant. So obviously you started with a literature review, had to look at all the literature on leadership and flourishing, and then what kind of impact leaders could have on human flourishing. So that was the start of the research project, and hugely enjoyable. Thoroughly recommend studying flourishing because it's so uplifting, because it just shows you what potential we all have to influence the flourishing of others. So the theories of school leadership that I considered were these. And then if we just go on to the leadership theories considered, brilliant. And then obviously came up with using Su et al.'s model of psychological flourishing. Yeah, I'll just hold there for a sec. Brilliant. So what was really, really interesting about the leadership theory, specifically in school leadership, was that none of them were talking specifically about flourishing. Sometimes flourishing was mentioned a little bit as an outcome. It was sometimes implicit in the theory, but it was never the primary aim of any of these theories. In school leadership, a bit more in the kind of general leadership literature, so kind of the responsible, value-centered servant, and positive leadership and humanistic management in particular, they were looking much more at flourishing as an outcome, but it wasn't the primary concern of these theories. And yeah, again, as I said earlier, really important to find a simple way of conceptualizing flourishing that had been tested for its kind of psychometric properties, but was also going to work for teachers in a school context. So 3 research questions. Obviously, wanted to know what teachers understood by flourishing. That was a really important start point. And all of the kind of dimensions of flourishing that Sue and Al mentioned, they were all covered by teachers. Teachers reported all of those as being important to their flourishing. So that was quite interesting. And then obviously, really importantly, what do they believe leaders could do to improve their flourishing? And then got into a bit of practitioner research, which was a kind of collaborative and participatory phase, where I was asking what are the impacts of the collaborative creation of interventions that aim to improve the flourishing of teaching staff. And that was really, really fun, getting teachers to come up with ideas that can improve their own and their colleagues' flourishing. It was a mixed methods research. So obviously started off with a lot of pilots, used questionnaires, obviously with kind of your traditional ratings questions, but also open questions, more pilots. You've got to have plenty of pilots. And then we went into some focus groups to understand what teachers were thinking about flourishing. But then we went into ones that allowed them to design interventions. They tried them out, and then they reflected on the progress of the interventions, made them even better. And then we had a final focus group to reflect on what the impact of those interventions that the teachers had designed themselves were. So really, really fun research, very enjoyable. So the discussion really focused around how could school leaders improve the flourishing of teachers? And ended up coming up with this model, leadership for teacher flourishing. And the first part of the model was how. So how could school leaders improve the flourishing of teachers? And a few things came out really, really strongly. So being supportive and compassionate, trustworthiness, giving autonomy, empowering our teachers, actually giving them that freedom to be creative and enabling them to grow. Teachers really wanted to be thanked. They wanted to be valued. And they wanted leaders to focus on their strengths and really recognise what they were good at. And they wanted to be able to focus on meaningful work. And this was a really big thing, actually, that came out. Teachers are really stressed. They are working crazy hours, but they don't mind. They don't mind working those hours if they believe what they're doing is improving pupil outcomes and enabling the pupils that they work with to be the best versions of themselves and to flourish. What they do mind is kind of the policies that absolutely crush them. So unnecessary data collection. One teacher told me about a marking policy that was going to take her 55 hours per week if she were to enact it correctly with all of her classes. So these kind of things teachers are finding very, very difficult. So that was really interesting. And actually, then what we kind of thought about from this was, well, what does all of this mean? So if we could go on, Ed. And a lot of it was a question of leaders being virtuous, because when leaders are virtuous, all of those good things that you saw in the previous slide become possible. And love, we think, is particularly important. And this is an area we're really, really interested in. Really excited about the measurement of love group over at Harvard. And we think that that's going to be a really key virtue. Some more virtues that could influence teacher flourishing as well. These all emerged too. But the difficulty is that virtues are subjective. So what I mean by a certain virtue, say, for example, kindness, might be really different to what, say, Ed means by kindness. And so people understand virtues differently. The other difficult thing is that acts can be defined differently. So say, for example, a colleague offered to cover a another teacher's lesson so that they could go and see their child's nativity play. Now, one person might say that was an act of compassion, but another might say, oh no, that's an act of selflessness. Or another might say, no, definitely an act of love. So actually, what we name virtues is quite difficult because they mean different things to different people. Also, the virtuous dispositions that you actually need to promote flourishing vary depending on the situation. So, for example, if you want to be an empowering leader, and that's brilliant, really, really fantastic. And that could be an amazing thing for a teacher who's been teaching for a few years. They do not want you checking every lesson plan. They don't want you in the back of their classes. They don't want you telling them how to mark. And that's amazing. But a brand new teacher, straight out of teacher training, if you gave them huge amounts of autonomy and were hugely empowering, that might be really, really stressful for them. So again, it depends very much on the situation, which particular disposition you need. Also, people need different kinds of support. They need different kinds of compassion. People like to be thanked in different ways. So, you know, the way you express gratitude needs to be very nuanced to the people that you're working with. And that led to a really major conclusion that actually one of the first things a leader must do is know their people incredibly well. Once you know your people, then you've got a much better idea of how to look after them, how to be caring, how to be loving, how to be compassionate for them, how to be empowering. So there were a number of factors that were enabling the behaviours actually impacted. So going right back again to Sue et al, and the really, really important dimensions of flourishing that teachers really cared about were positive relationships. They cared about growth, and they cared a lot about meaning and purpose. And the fourth one that they really cared about was subjective well-being. Another part of the research was to review policy, specifically in the UK, our national professional qualifications, which are the leadership programmes that are recommended for all teachers who would like to be promoted. And the really tragic thing is there is not one mention of flourishing or well-being throughout there. Huge amount of really, really helpful stuff on accountability, on partnerships, on measuring performance, but nothing specifically or explicitly on flourishing. So that could be a real area of growth for UK policy. So in conclusion for this project, there's a really, really significant impact of teacher ill-being. So we've got over half of teachers in that YouGov survey reporting that they're experiencing anxiety, and nearly a third saying that they feel hopeless. So at all times, school leadership matters greatly for teachers and therefore also student wellbeing. But I would argue that during COVID-19, it's even more important. And love to propose the leadership teacher flourishing model could be used to create a positive impact on flourishing in schools. It definitely needs refining, and we're working on that at the moment in our educational leadership for flourishing group in particular, but also our general leadership for flourishing group. But the foundation of this model is know your people so that you can love them really effectively. And the really good news for everybody is that each individual human being on the planet has the opportunity to improve flourishing. So over to you, Ed, for our hopes for the future.
Thanks, Katie, so much. So I guess we've started at the beginning trying to connecting these two big ideas of human flourishing and leadership, and suggesting that there's an important conceptual integration that's possible and a really important practical integration that's possible here. And we think this could apply across sectors, but has a really, really important application in education. And as Katie's outlined from the research that she's done, she's started to show just that, and to think about much more granular level of what that could actually mean for teachers and those leading other teachers in schools. So where do we want to go forward from here? Well, if you like, we're now going to kind of zoom out again more widely to the bigger picture of flourishing and leading. So this is the big idea, I guess, that we've got, is to integrate these two things, integrating the science of flourishing with the arts of leading. So applying this recent research that has been done on flourishing to reimagine the purpose and activity of leadership. We think this could further flourishing in organizations globally, and we want to focus on doing that, but in central sectors of society. And we've begun already. So the research project that Fiona mentioned at the beginning, we're starting to explore character and leadership, and character being the central aspect of flourishing. We're starting to explore character and leadership in tech, law, finance, and in business. So some important sectors there. Katy's work on education, we'd love to think about healthcare and government. So focusing on some central sectors of society and doing that in partnership with others. And so prioritizing impact globally, and particularly in LMIC countries, we'd love to do. And as Katy mentioned, we've started, and Katy's been leading with Emmy Bidston, these brilliant communities of practice for leading and flourishing, a general one, and the one particularly focused on the sector of education. Just to throw in there, just bringing in again some further research to kind of highlight, I guess, where the opportunity here is. So this is some research that Jan-Emmanuel Deneuve, who heads the Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre, the brilliant Wellbeing Research Centre, and he works as a professor at the SIA Business School. A paper he wrote on work and well-being, which was taken up by McKinsey in their McKinsey Quarterly in January of last year. In this piece by Tara Alice and Bill Shanninger. But if you look at the diagram there, it shows just in a small way what the possibility is here. So if you take drivers of life satisfaction, job satisfaction there is really important to that. So if we just focus in this one metric, job satisfaction, what's that made up of? Well, a significant part of that is interpersonal relationships, and a significant part of that is relationships with management. So even through this kind of one lens, if you like, in terms of job satisfaction, the relationships and the relationship with one's boss, you could see how there could be amazing knock-on effects. If the leaders, then thinking about the those in management perhaps, had flourishing as a focused way in mind, the flourishing of their people, and that flows through into their interpersonal relationships, that then could flow through to the happiness and life satisfaction of many people and be an important contribution. So there's an opportunity, and that's a simple way of to illustrate something of what this opportunity is, even from one angle, and that excellent work that Jan-Emmanuel Deneuve's been doing and is doing. But the opportunity is then to fill in, if you like, the widespread agreement over what leadership is and should be, a kind of widespread failure of leadership as it's reported widely, but a failure that is a failure in the face of changing times, complexity, uncertainty, and the kind of ill-fittingness, I guess, of a previous leadership model based on command and control to times when we can't command and control. It's all too evident that that's not possible. There's been a shift to new leadership, but not quite an agreement on what that paradigm is. And here's the opportunity for flourishing. The literatures exist and are emerging on these separate topics, and the opportunity, we think, exists to combine them innovatively in theory and in practice, developing mixed methods of research to measure and scalable interventions to apply and further impact. Of course, there are some challenges we've identified and are focusing on some, and no doubt you'll have others which we'd love to hear and to talk about further. Integration's an important one. So here the academic research and the practice need to work together. Without the academic model and research, the practical interventions will run out of steam. Without the path to action, the model remains in journals. So we found there's been this important integration when we're talking about this work on flourishing. It's got to land in people's lives. Contextualization. So how do we develop a validated model for leading and flourishing with the right kinds of contextualization to be useful and helpful and relevant around the world? And there's some important work that needs to be done with global partners in order to understand and contextualize a model and a measure. And communication here as well. So some work, I think, to challenge perceptions of flourishing as a soft idea versus strong leadership of command and control versus those things that are important to get on in society. and not simply to thrive. As if thriving is something we can say, it's something you might simply do, and as if the real business is elsewhere. We firmly believe it's the opposite, but there's some communication challenges around how that is conveyed. What would we love to do? What are our hopes for the future and how we might step forward? Well, we'd love to go forward over the next 10 years. We've got a lovely plan we'd love to share with you at some point. But how are we hoping to step forward from here? Well, the first stage is to do some interdisciplinary concept mapping and theory mapping, consolidating research partnerships, developing these communities of practice, and establishing a global conference. And I'll say something about that Katy's leading. I'll say something about that in just a second. Further to that, then, developing and piloting measures globally to inform this model and measure to test it, and then developing resources for case study trials around the world. The conference, and we'd love you to come, is going to be now the start of next year, so the 5th of January 2022, and it's going to be wonderful to be able to bring hopefully many people from around the world here to Oxford. We'll see what's happening by that point, but we'd love that to be the case. That would be a first step and represent the kind of work that's being done, I guess, in these current times in an amazing way, to be able to connect with people who wouldn't otherwise, but then to bring people together for a conference in order to consolidate and to move forward. One thing I will say is that some of our work already is online. So we're working with the Harvard, the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. Actually, it was in the middle of last year, we developed an online course, which you're welcome to go on and have a look at and to access, thinking about leading and flourishing. And that will give you more ideas, and a practical course which you can share. It's completely free to access and to enjoy. Please feel free to go and have a look. It's on the Oxford Characters Project website. The final thing to say, Katy, have you got anything to add on things going forward before we wrap up and open for questions? I think you're on mute, Katy.
Thanks so much. I was just going to say a massive thank you to David, Luana and Fiona for inviting us. What a joy to get to speak to you all and get to work with Ed on this. So yeah, massive thank you.
Well, super. I would like to echo your thanks, to thank both of you, and to say that it was an amazing presentation. That's there's been some comments to that effect in the chat. I think what I really like about this is that with COVID, we're recognizing not only the limits of the educational model, which has been thrown into sharp relief by the crisis, but also our concept of leadership. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to talk about this and to look at different ways of reimagining leadership. My colleague, David Johnson, would like to make a few comments to start off the question and answer session. If you want to ask a question, if you could raise your hand in the chat. So on the top of your screen, there is a hand raising function, or you can just write your question into the chat and Luana and I will pick it up and share that with Ed and Katy. So thank you, Katy and Ed, once again.
Thanks, Fiona, Katy and Ed, absolutely stupendous. What a wonderful tour de force through this work. Ed, I'll start with your very careful leading us through the literature and looking at the connections between, and sometimes the disagreements between the philosophers, the psychologists, and the educationalists now getting their hands on these concepts. And what I particularly made notes on, not only the sort of careful way in which you remind us of the Aristotelian sort of concept there, meaning of flourishing. But what I liked particularly are 2 points you made. One really is on activity and actualization. And I really like the idea that human flourishing is seen either as an activity or, more to the point for me, takes place within an activity setting. I like the idea of actualization, which of course for the psychologist in me would immediately think of Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and the extent to which that for years and years has been challenges to that model of actualization. But what I've taken really from the way in which you've led us through this is really actualization really as a prospective growth model. So actualization, if the way I understood it is correct, is that flourishing isn't an end point, but that flourishing is part of a prospective growth model. That in a sense, as we talk about it in our little project, a sort of becoming, and it's perhaps more important to monitor those pathways, those routes, that process of actualization, rather than end up with a definitional end point, which might be more problematic. And then to turn to Katy's work, which I think absolutely fascinating, and perhaps Katy too. Well, first of all, I really like the, if you like, the list of human characteristics that I think came from Sue and Tay and Dina's work. I think that you mentioned on trustworthiness and virtues and integrity, virtuousness and integrity, and so on, love, and is absolutely wonderful. And my mind started running wild as usual, and tried to look at sort of Ed's depiction of activity and your work on leadership, and particularly you're looking at a particular activity setting at a school, looking at teachers, looking at leaders. And I think that's fantastic. And Luana and I have done a lot of thinking and a lot of work ourselves on the concept of activity settings and the kind of actualization within. And I think for us, it's really that different activity settings would lead to would have different outcomes. So for the Russian psychologists, certainly for Vygotsky, there's a kind of triangular model of mediating tool or artifact. The subject, which in Katy's case is the teacher, and the object, perhaps organizational flourishing, perhaps parental happiness, perhaps childhood happiness. And where I like the connection is this list of human characteristics, perhaps as mediational means. So do leaders mediate the flourishing of teachers by demonstrating these characteristics of trustworthiness, virtuousness, and so on, with the outcome perhaps being the flourishing of the organization, the school, and indeed prospectively so, because as the school prospectively flourishes from year to year to year, so too do the subjects within the setting, the people within the setting, the human activists flourish too. So I think that's all fantastic and brilliantly positive for me. And then, of course, one or two naughty questions emerge as they would. And there's a colleague of mine, retired now, Eric Hoyle, who did quite a lot of work. He was in Manchester and then at Bristol on leadership with a colleague called Peter John. And they published a book now several years ago, on leadership with a salient concept, and they sort of demonstrated that with lots of practical examples. But they looked at head teachers, school leaders and other leaders, and they looked at, which is why I think our research project struggles with these concepts of uncertainty and broader societal change. And for Hoyle and John, they said, well, as the demands on schools change and the demands on leaders change, leaders have become people in schools with parking spaces. They now wear jackets and ties or power outfits if they are women, and so on. But Hoyle and John use this wonderful concept of principled infidelity. And it says that what leaders have as part of their characteristics, is the ability, in a sense, to disrupt the system, to protect what they believe in. But these are different virtues. These are perhaps competing or contesting virtues, character traits and strengths that are necessary in order to protect an organization and all within it from flourishing. And so, with that, I think really, Katy, not necessarily for this discussion, but, perhaps at another time, could we look at schools as activity settings and place leaders in different positions in those triangles, and look what those relationships mean, and look at that particularly in relation to this this list of characteristics. But overall, what a fantastic presentation, both, and I'm sure there'll be many questions, and I thank you. I really thank you for taking the time and putting this effort into this work. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So, are there any questions? Oh, yes, hand. No,
Hi, I think.
Oops, sorry. Rachel, over to you.
Hi, Katy. Nice to see you. I just was wondering about the sort of like interaction. You talked a little bit about the interaction of your work and research with sort of jobs and things like that, but I wondered if you had any sort of partnerships or things with businesses, because I've heard sort of similar ideas coming from people like Timpson's, who have looked into human flourishing in part of their leadership model. I just wondered if you could speak more into that.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah, I absolutely love the Timpson's model for so many reasons. But actually, the expert on business partnerships is really Ed. So Ed, I'm going to hand this one over to you, because Ed's actually doing a massive research project on this.
Thanks. Guys, sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch it. Thanks so much.
I was just sort of wondering how you were going to take this this research and this idea into the business area, and what were your plans for that?
Super, thanks, Rachel. That's that's a great segue into some work that we're doing just at the moment with a big research project, which we're thinking about under the heading of character and responsible leadership. So what we're trying to do is a few things here. One is make some connections with how leadership is understood currently in industry, how good leadership's understood, and it's understood with values importantly at its heart. And there's been this wonderful turn towards values-based or responsible leadership, and the language varies. So the first thing we're doing is trying to get a handle on how these terms are understood and what's central to them, and then thinking about really the contribution as how values can be enacted and operationalized. And so there's this gap that exists perhaps between some of these theories and the aspirations and the practice. And this is where this deep philosophy around character and virtues can and flourishing can really take off for us by giving us a much deeper concept of a deeper understanding of that space and the movement from values perhaps to action, which perhaps is worked through in a kind of behavioralist paradigm at the moment, but can work through really with a deeper understanding of the human person. And so engaging people as a whole, not just their actions, but their motivations, their cognitions as well. And so be able to operationalize values much more effectively in companies can help us to live up to the aspirations, I think, of this human-centered approach that people are after, and achieve for individuals and also for their organizations then the kinds of flourishing that are in tune with who they are and who they could become. So it's really digging into some trends which are already emerging, I think, in the business world and the discussion, but filling in perhaps with some deeper conceptual resources, some gaps that are there, and we think could be kind of helpfully, not just plugged, but really worked into deeply and brought out and taken forward.
Super. I'd like to call on Jonathan Beale. Jonathan, if you could introduce yourself as well, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm John Beale, researcher in residence at Eton College. Thank you, Katy and Ed, for that fascinating talk. I really enjoyed that and learned a great deal. My question's for you, Katy, about one of the studies you did. One of the questions you had was what do teaching staff understand by the term flourishing, including school leaders? I'm really fascinated to learn what what your data shows about what people in schools, teachers and school leaders, tend to think this term means. If you could elaborate on that a little.
Yeah, absolutely. So the dimensions, I guess that they thought of it quite dimensionally, which was quite interesting. So they would talk about so psychologists tend to break flourishing down into dimensions and say that you need to be doing well in all these dimensions to be flourishing. So the dimension that was most frequently and I guess most passionately talked about were positive relationships. And interestingly, positive relationships with colleagues were talked about more than positive relationships with management or leadership, which is interesting because that's contrasting results to Jan Emmanuel Deneuve's paper with McKinsey. So I'm not sure why that is, but I think that would be really interesting. The second thing that came up a lot was growth and the opportunity to develop and get better at things. So often, I suppose, mastery is used in the psychological literature. That wasn't used at all by teachers, and they didn't really talk about accomplishment that much. They talked much more about growing and developing. The third thing was subjective well-being. They did talk a lot about life satisfaction, not being too stressed, feeling happy about going to work. So that was the third one. And the fourth one was having a sense of meaning and purpose. So those were the four dimensions that came out most strongly for what teachers understood by flourishing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions? I'd like to open the floor. David, do you have any final comments to make?
No, not for now, thanks, Fiona.
Well, I'd like to say a big thank you again to Ed and Katy for their terrific talk and for the interesting questions that prompted the discussion. Just to let you know that there will be a recording of this seminar if you want to share this with anyone. At the moment, you have to email me to get a link, but Luana and I are planning a YouTube channel in the not too distant future. So we'll see how that gets on. Next week, we have Professor Christensen from the Jubilee Centre of Birmingham. He's going to give a paper on 4 accounts of flourishing as the aim of education, a synthesis, and 10 remaining problems. So thank you. I hope you can all join us then. Actually, I've just had a quick question in from Concepcion Naval from the University of Navarra. Concepcion, would you like to ask a quick question just in our final few minutes? Or maybe I can ask it for you. She says, what do you think, Katy, Ed, about the usual objection that calls this point of view about flourishing utopian? I tend to think that, yes, it is certainly a bit utopian, but we really need a point of utopia in education. That's quite a nice question to finish with. A few brief words, please.
Ed, go for it, and I'll come after you.
I think it is, if you understand utopian positively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Katy, you got further thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we definitely need, I suppose if you are talking about positivity, we definitely need positivity in education, and why not? But like Ed says, I think I'd be really interested to dig into what we mean by utopian and how we're defining utopia. But no, absolutely. Yeah, I think let's have, you know, the most joyful and loving and, you know, happy version of flourishing in schools, because they really should be, yeah, happy, joyful places, because if school isn't happy, where else in society can be?
Well, on that very positive and enthusiastic note, thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you all next week at the same time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Many thanks indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Nice to meet you all.
Bye. Thank you.